Going way back, and I know we get all our information now from the show Mad Men, because that's exactly how advertising was. Really? No, it was exactly like that. But this band, if we go a little bit and think about data, creativity, and strategy, these three guys, I'm not sure which one was data in this picture, but I bet I know who creative was at least. But when I think of this band worked really well. This is an amazing band. They made some incredible music. And in that business, you had data, you had researchers, and that insight and those early insights really helped this band rock. And the fact is, this consumer data was an up-and-coming thing. People started learning how advertising worked. And it really kind of changed things. And you had very strong research insights, good strategic thinking, which probably at the time was done by people who were called account people, and an incredible rise in creativity. And often you talk about the burn-back era and that kind of work coming up. Sometimes the band got a little out of hand. And in fact, data sometimes, in many cases, became an enemy of creativity. Or better to say, it became the enemy of good creative. And I think that was a problem because a lot of, as things evolved and kind of broke down a bit, people looked to data as a way to sell the work. Don't tell me if the work or the creative is good. Sell it to the client. And you know, you can only do that so many times until you lose basically all your credibility. At the same time, you recall, if anyone does their ad studies, because heck, I've been around a while, but this is even before my time, the client-side business started bringing data in themselves. They decided they needed to own the data, which is funny because I'm hearing lots of people saying today that clients are once more saying, I need to own my data. But as you did that, a lot of the research in the agencies became redundant. You fast forward to the 80s, and there was the same time, Paul Weller and the Jam were coming on music, and you had this new British invasion. You also had a British invasion in the advertising business. And those of you who were around a while will recall, suddenly you had account planners. And it's from a BMP model, and account planners were pretty cool, because you usually had to be British to be an account planner, though some Australians pretended to be British. You know, I unfortunately worked with a really brilliant account planner who happened to be Irish, bit of a problem. But that idea of those account planners, they displaced a lot of the research. In fact, their intuition-led anthropological approach to this kind of shook things up because it was pretty provocative. And you got some really tangible insights that creatives could work well from. A lot of times, if we look at the musical thing, this became a global phenomenon. The fact is, there was something massively appealing to this formula. You had people giving you really interesting insights that were observed from people. And it's interesting, given the previous presentation, a lot of good account planners read people very well. They would do ethnographies, they would go into homes. They would look how people actually responded to stuff. And that kind of substantial response was very valuable. It helped shape some really good work. But a lot of times, though, it was right, and it became really interesting, and heck, it broke a lot of new ground. It changed things. You know, the fact is, this became the business. And we're doing pretty well, and the fact is, things worked pretty well. There were some fantastic campaigns that sold a lot of product, but the reality was, things started breaking up. And even in the agency world, in the major agency world, you started unbundling things. You lost the media guys. They went off and did their own show. A lot of the data guys kind of got shunted aside to become data specialists. And so all these kind of interesting characters kind of created solo careers. And some of them, like my friend Sting here, were really, really successful, except for the lute music. But the reality is data, creativity, and strategy flourished as standalone businesses. very successful data businesses, very successful strategic thinking, creative, again, doing pretty well. And a lot of folks, like our friend Ice Cube here, really involved their talents. They grew. There was some really new, interesting stuff here. The fact that this man was in Public Enemy and is now kind of the franchise of Barbershop, pretty cool. But the fact is, as digital and social went mainstream too, this data and creativity found some new dimensions. And again, once more, pretty darn successful. Hey, the model works. And the model works pretty well. But you have to start questioning as we came to, oh, I'm leaving off the most important part, our friend Lady Gaga, right? New talents. I imagine a lot of you guys have actually shops that are brand new enterprises or recent enterprises that came out of this new era whole. This is, you've got an entirely new, incredible, successful town. And basically, we had new ways of working, too. People were using social specialties. They were using data specialties. Big agency holding companies were trying to figure out what they were doing. The media guys were hiring creative people. The creative agencies were hiring media people. You were either a digital standalone or you were a digital standalone and the big shops sucked you back in, but maybe you spun off to another thing. But ultimately, this idea, there's a lot of talent on this, and we kind of wound to the present. And probably in the past couple of years, a lot of folks, particularly the big holding companies, and again, I work with one of the big holding companies, and you see it across the board, the world is ready for a change. You know what? There was a certain point where we were missing something. And I'd like to sum it up in kind of a simple 3 blocks. The strategy guys, well, they were still relying on instinct in a world of behavioral data. Because I know there's a lot of behavioral data, a lot of data, and yes, the strategy guys are using data, but for the most part, they weren't. They glancing at the top. The data guys, and we have an amazing data business, and they had zettabytes. I love that, zettabytes. It's bigger than terabytes. I mean, huge bytes of data. But you know what? For the most part, a lot of those data companies are still back office companies. I don't mean to insult that, but I talk to CMOs all the time, and they're not talking to a lot of their data people. They have specialists talking to data people. It's amazing that a CMO, maybe it explains why CMOs have an 18-month lifespan in some cases, but there's a huge amount of data out there they're not connecting with. And creativity, they're still playing on that thing of, well, I know what works, but I only know what works half the time. And to think about that aspect of, creative in our industry is still coming from, in many cases, a 30 and 40-year-old tradition. And while storytelling is eternal, how we motivate people and engage people in advertising, that part we can update. So what happens? Maybe it's time to get the band back together again. And I was looking for an example of a band that got back together, and I think of Van Halen. And I come from, before in advertising, I was in the rock and roll world, so that's why I do stupid analogies. But I'm not sure I would get Eddie Van Halen's son in my bands, but anyway. But the idea of adding this new idea, of bringing this back together, is something that at Havas we explored. And what I'm going to take you through is working and bringing in a communications agency, bringing data teams back into the front of the process, making them part of the strategic planning enterprise. So in our case, we now have 15 data specialists, full-up data guys who come from the digital world and the database world, working as part of the strategic planning group, and they actually sit with the creative people. And we take those data people, we are partnering them with planners, your strategic and account people, and aligning that directly to the creative development process. So we had a challenge. We're pitching the Atlantic City tourism account. And you looked at Atlantic City and you said, geez, they needed a lot of help. They had been on a steady decline. their revenue, their guests, down, 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 down. We weren't sure where the bottom was, but it was pretty bad. And you'd talk to consumers about Atlantic City. And usually you don't have a barrier to buying a product is, well, I don't want to go there and get killed. Now try to think about the ad that says, you probably won't get killed. That headline didn't really work very well. Now, they had gone to some very smart people. They'd worked with McKinsey. They'd worked with a couple of research companies. But what they ended up, they were trying to do segmentations. And, well, maybe we can get parents with kids to go. Maybe we can get old people to go or young people to go. But the reality of this was those weren't working very well. So our strategy team got together. And one thing happened was our data team actually took a bunch of composites of Hitwise. Basically, they said, let's look at all the casinos, combine their traffic, and see what kind of people they are. Who goes to the website as a proxy. Then they looked at who goes to all the Las Vegas websites, and then more importantly, who goes to the Connecticut websites, which are the competition for Atlantic City. And what they saw immediately in that is the base of Atlantic City loyalists were actually very diverse. And then they started building from there on building profiles of, this wasn't this kind of homogeneous audience. It was a lot of very different people all out for having fun. Except their fun was very different. Every group here had a different kind of fun. And then you went there and observed that kind of thing, and it was very rare. You would sit in a restaurant, there'd be a bunch of 20-something girls for a bachelorette party. There were a bunch of Wall Street guys. There were a bunch of empty nester, kind of well-to-do boomers here. There was a bunch of Latino guys in their 30s. And you sat there and said, geez, this is an interesting group of people. They're all having a good time. They really have nothing to do with each other. But the idea of all of this fun and building on it, and the idea of saying what we're looking at is a fundamental pursuit of a good time and to cut loose. And it's an easy way to get there and cut loose. Now this is giving the whole sense of the work, but in a simple thought, building that and building that whole ethos out throughout people's engagement, throughout their experience, actually turn that decline around. And actually, to turn that decline around faster than we modeled, we saw an absolute wonderful kick up on that. And again, they were bringing new people in. It's a long road ahead for them. And Hurricane Sandy didn't help that. But surprisingly, actually, the Atlantic City Boardwalk was not really hit by Sandy. So if you are interested in going there, they are open for business. And the fact is that kind of response of this is what you want to do, this is the kind of weekend getaway you're looking for. Now let's go to Dos Equis. And Dos Equis, you probably have heard of the campaign, The Most Interesting Man in the World. Its meme, it was a digital, it changed things completely. When you have something where I don't always drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis. We've seen it in cartoons and kids' movies, which wasn't very good. But the idea of we're seeing that term, I don't always, and when I do, I blank. The whole legendary line about all the things he does. We had thousands and thousands of people every day posting new legend lines about this character. But what we had to understand is this is like being a showrunner. What is the arc of the campaign? How long can you play something really good? And the fact is, what we want to understand was, how do you judge whether a campaign is arcing? Because you ask people, do you like the campaign? The answer is unanimously yes. Yeah, I love it. You sit there and go, okay, that doesn't help me very much, because everybody loves this thing until the day they get bored with it, and then they won't love it anymore, and they're not going to give me a warning on that. So one of the things the team did, and I hope I have it in here, I think we do have this piece, is the data team did something very simple. And that is, they said, just look at searches for the most interesting man in the world in Google Trends. Now I'm thinking of a room of people who would do this. Oh yeah, sure, that's great. that's an easy thing to do. It's an incredibly obvious thing to do, except every time I show this to client organizations, they're like, oh crap, that correlated to our business. The interesting thing here is this campaign has been on a steady climb. And in fact, I think it's probably, as you see the arc there, it is flattening. And the interesting point is, as you see things evolve, this is a year when this starts telling me when it's curving up beautifully and that interest is curving, just as an idea. The question is, at a certain point, you're going to start peaking over. Now, have we seen the peak most interesting man in the world? Well, let's think about that, but how do you evolve that? How do you keep that fresh? What's just come out this year, and this is another episode of him and all the world around him. Now, that's an interesting case of when you're working in a space where you're involved with an idea that's incredibly strong, and the sense of that connection of bringing data into this conversation of something that is pure entertainment. And again, sometimes the solution is a very, very simple data piece. A lot of that interest is then what we don't show, and this is the part that was kind of difficult when given this charge, is a lot of the secondary, and now the validation of that insight, was data that is proprietary to clients. And basically, for 3 clients I asked, each one of them said, you can't show that data. So where we go on this stuff is also not to show, yes, I did a single run and that solved the world, but it led me somewhere that I was able to validate. For New York Life, an insurance company, does life insurance. The life insurance category is really grim. Aside from MetLife, which is Snoopy and the Peanuts sell you life insurance, and they've done so for 40-something years, brilliant campaign, most life insurance messaging is, buy life insurance, because if you die, your family will be homeless. So then you go, okay, I'm thinking of the ad, of the kids wailing and in the street, and that would be very emotive. But the reality is that's not going to work very well, because what happens is every time we show that, people don't actually act. So one of the things the strategy team had to find is, what is the motivation? What's that customer motivation? And quite simply, we saw in data, and it was a whole list of behavioral data, attitudinal data, but I can sum it up with this. Weirdly, life insurance buyers are optimists. Life insurance buyers show much more activity in communities, their behavioral stuff, they're engaged in news, they're engaged in life, but also they think the world is going to come out okay, which is a very interesting thing for people buying insurance in case they die. But when you posit on that, what happens is I buy this insurance to make sure things are okay, and then I can go on living my life. I'm not afraid of this. I want to get it out of the way and go. So the type of ad is, you might die, things could happen. That threat, no. And this inspired a creative team directly, because they said, this is the idea. And they came up with this, building a new model. It's not just putting the data guys in the room and ignoring them, which we've tried in the past, but it's establishing systems and a common strategic language, a dialogue. You start integrating your actual process to work in data. It's creating measures of success for these groups, but building individual accountability into that. It's actually kind of modifying your operating system and structuring yourself differently. Because if you don't structure yourself differently and you do these other things, it's not going to work. And the other part is internally and externally how you communicate this. So he asked on how do you move analytics and creative together. It is part of designing an actual how an agency functions and works. It's a very different head count. It's a very different skill set. But in doing that, I think you can get to some very interesting results. And those results are obviously measurable, which is going to change our game, and it's really where we need to go. So I thank you very much.